I'm opening this file quietly and checking the historical details first, so the narration can remain accurate while keeping every citation and research note outside the spoken script. The Peter Bergmann case begins for you beside a rain-dulled window in Sligo, where a purple bag passes quietly beneath the gaze of a hotel camera. Settle into the chair and let the pace become unhurried. We'll follow the unknown traveler slowly, beginning with the ordinary objects he carried, the rooms he crossed, and the patient record left behind. It was Friday, the 12th of June, 1909, and the afternoon light over Derry had softened beneath a pale northern sky. At the Ulster bus depot, an older man waited among the muted sounds of engines, footsteps and luggage wheels brushing over concrete. You can picture him near the platform, holding a black shoulder bag and a small suitcase, while diesel fumes drifted through the cool air. Nothing in the surviving record suggests that anyone found him remarkable then. The man appeared to be somewhere between his late 50s and late 60s, though estimates would vary after his death. He was tall and thin, with grey hair, blue eyes, and a face that seemed composed rather than expressive. When you examine the later descriptions, you find a neatly dressed traveller whose black leather jacket and dark trousers suited the damp weather. His manner was polite, and his English carried what witnesses remembered as a strong Germanic accent. Somewhere between 2:30 and 4 that afternoon, he boarded a bus bound for Sligo, on the western side of Ireland. The journey would have taken him through a landscape of low hills, fields divided by hedges, and towns whose windows caught the passing light. You sit with the timetable and imagine the gentle vibration of the seat, the warm glass beside his shoulder, and the soft rattle of belongings overhead. Whatever he was thinking, the road kept its own steady rhythm. The bus reached Sligo at 28 minutes past 6, when the evening still held several hours of northern summer light. He stepped down with the other passengers, carrying the same black shoulder bag and ordinary piece of luggage seen in Derry. You might pause over that first clear time in the file, because precise minutes often become small anchors when everything else remains uncertain. At 6:28, the man who would call himself Peter Bergmann entered the record. There is no confirmed account of where he had been before Derry, or how he had reached the bus station that afternoon. No ticket preserved in the file takes you further back, and no reliable camera sequence follows him across another border or terminal. His earlier path seems to end at the edge of the surviving footage, like a pencil line fading where the paper has been rubbed. We can only begin where the images begin, with his luggage in his hands and the cool Sligo evening around him. He first sought a room at one hotel, but accommodation there wasn't available, so he continued his quiet search. Eventually, he took a taxi to the Sligo City Hotel on Quay Street, close to the river and the center of town. You can imagine the fabric of the taxi seat, the faint smell of rain carried inside, and shop fronts moving slowly beyond the glass. The journey was short, but it brought him into the small circle of places investigators would later study with unusual care. At reception, the traveler paid cash in advance for 3 nights, removing any need to present a bank card bearing a legal name. He filled in the hotel form and wrote Peter Bergmann, offering an address said to be in Vienna, Austria. The clerk accepted the details as part of an ordinary evening transaction, amid ringing telephones and the dry movement of paper across the desk. You can almost hear the pen making its brief, soft scratches. That written name is the first thing you learn to hold lightly, because investigators later determined that it wasn't his own. The address he supplied couldn't be found in Vienna, and its wording didn't lead to a residence, neighbor, or familiar doorway. Even the postal information appeared inconsistent, leaving detectives with ink on a registration card, but no dependable place behind it. Peter Bergmann was therefore a name in the file, not an identity the file could prove. The distinction matters as we sit beside the case tonight, because an alias can be both useful and strangely empty. It lets a hotel assign a room, allows a receptionist to offer a key, and gives later investigators something simple to place on a folder. Yet it doesn't provide childhood, family, employment, or the familiar voice that once called the man home. You turn the page, and the name remains there in careful handwriting, carrying only the weight he chose to give it. His room was plain, private, and temporary, furnished for travelers who expected to stay briefly before moving onward. We can imagine the quiet click of the lock, the bedspread holding the day's coolness, and the curtains filtering the long June evening. His bags could be placed on the carpet, close enough to open without effort, while the sounds of Quay Street settled beyond the window. Nothing about such a room asks a guest to explain his past. Hotels are patient witnesses, although they understand very little while events are happening inside them. A corridor camera records a coat passing through its frame, and a receptionist remembers an accent only when someone asks about it days later. The lift rises, doors open, and a key returns briefly to the counter. When you review those fragments afterward, ordinary movements acquire a meaning they never possessed in the moment. Peter Bergmann remained reserved during his stay, and the people who encountered him recalled no long conversation or personal disclosure. He wasn't seen making social visits, meeting companions, or speaking into a mobile telephone as he moved around Sligo. His exchanges were practical ones, involving a room, a taxi, a bus timetable, and later a question about a quiet beach. You notice how the file is built almost entirely from these small, courteous transactions. The purple bag entered that record through surveillance footage, not through an object later placed on an evidence table. It appeared to be a reusable plastic carrier, flexible enough to fold and large enough to hold a changing collection of possessions. On several occasions, cameras recorded Peter Bergmann leaving the hotel, with the bag visibly full, then returning without anything apparent in his hands. The bag itself was never secured, labeled, or given a known owner. You can picture the camera image as detectives first saw it, slightly grainy and fixed within the hard rectangle of a monitor. There is the dark jacket, the measured walk, and the purple plastic gathered near one hand, its surface catching the flat indoor light. A recording provides shape and movement, but no texture, weight, or sound. So the bag remains partly outside our senses. We see it, yet we cannot hear its faint rustle. Over the 3 days of his hotel stay, Peter Bergmann was recorded leaving the building 13 times while carrying a full purple bag. Each return seemed to bring him back without the visible contents, though the exact fate of the carrier itself was less certain. It may have been folded into a pocket, or there may have been more than one similar bag among his belongings. As you make that notation, the honest word is simply unknown. The contents have never been reliably identified, and no camera captured him, clearly placing them into a particular bin. Investigators believed he may have been disposing of possessions that could reveal who he was, perhaps separating them among different locations across town. That remains an interpretation of his repeated journeys, not a direct view of what occurred beyond the cameras. You can hold the possibility gently without turning it into something more certain than the evidence allows. Sligo in 2009 had many surveillance cameras, yet their coverage was made of separate views rather than one continuous gaze. A figure might leave one frame, cross an uncovered pavement, and reappear later beside another doorway, with several private minutes missing between. You can feel how painstaking the work became as officers gathered recordings from businesses and followed timestamps across different machines. Every screen carried its own grey light and faint electronic hum. The detectives could trace many of Bergmann's routes, but not the moment when the purple bag became empty. There were streets, shop entrances, hotel doors, and public spaces where cameras offered partial confirmation of his movements. Between those points lay ordinary blind areas, including corners, alleys, and stretches of pavement beneath no lens at all. We shouldn't imagine disappearance as magic when the town itself contained so much unrecorded space. A rubbish collection may also erase evidence through routine rather than design, especially when no investigation has yet begun. Bags are lifted, bins are emptied, and refuse leaves town according to a timetable that doesn't wait for later questions. By the time detectives understood the importance of those repeated walks, anything discarded could have been mixed with countless anonymous household objects. You can almost smell wet cardboard and metal bins after rain, all of it already moving beyond recovery. This is one reason the title of the case can be slightly misleading, though its central question remains true. The purple bag had a person carrying it, but that person's real identity was never established, so no verifiable owner could be named. Nor was the bag itself recovered in a form that allowed investigators to examine a receipt, printed logo, fiber, or manufacturing mark. What remains is an image of ownership without the name that would complete it. The camera doesn't tell us whether the bag came from Derry, Sligo, Vienna, or somewhere far removed from all three. It doesn't show whether he had used it for years or obtained it during the journey. You might study the shade, the handles, and the softened corners, hoping that an ordinary commercial design could narrow the search. Yet plastic carriers are made to circulate quietly, passed from shop to home until their beginnings are forgotten. Nor can we know whether all 13 departures carried the same kind of contents, or whether separate things were removed little by little. Clothing, documents, medicine containers, correspondence, tickets, photographs, and personal notes have all been proposed, but none can be confirmed. A calm reading of the file leaves those imagined objects outside the evidence, however plausible they may seem. You close that speculative drawer and return to what the cameras actually show. They show a man walking with deliberation, though deliberation doesn't necessarily mean professional skill or secret training. Someone familiar with any town can notice cameras, while someone seeking privacy may simply prefer quieter corners. Investigators observed that Bergmann appeared to avoid having his disposal movements recorded, yet the surviving footage cannot reveal how carefully he planned each route. As you watch beside them, intention remains the softest and most difficult trace. The purple bag interests us because it sat between the known and unknown parts of Peter Bergmann's final journey. It was visible enough to be remembered, useful enough to carry what he no longer wished to keep, and ordinary enough to leave almost no history of its own. In another case, detectives might have found it beneath paperwork in a storeroom and tested every crease. Here, we have only a moving patch of color, but before the purple bag could acquire its later importance. Peter Bergmann made another ordinary journey through Sligo, and the paper trail briefly widened. On Saturday, the 13th of June, he left the hotel and walked toward the town's post office. The morning air would have been mild, carrying the mixed smells of river water, pavement, and shops opening for the day. At 10:49, he purchased 8 stamps valued at 82 cents each, along with airmail stickers. You find that entry in the timeline, exact in its minute and modest in its details. No letters linked to the purchase were recovered, and investigators couldn't establish with certainty what he intended to send. Perhaps the envelopes were already prepared, or perhaps he bought the stamps for a purpose he later abandoned. There is no known postal item bearing his handwriting beyond the hotel form, and no recipient ever came forward with a final message. We can place the stamps on the counter, but we cannot follow them beyond that point. The transaction nevertheless suggests a practical familiarity with what he needed. Since 8 stamps and airmail labels form a specific little purchase, you may imagine the smooth stamp paper beneath his fingertips and the muted sounds of customers waiting behind him. A clerk completed the exchange, and Bergmann returned to the street carrying something small enough to disappear inside a pocket. The post office gave detectives a firm location, but not a destination for his thoughts. This is often the character of patient investigation, where a confirmed fact creates several gentle questions without answering any of them. The receipt can tell you the value, the date, and the approximate time, while remaining silent about the words an envelope might have contained. A camera may show him arriving and leaving, yet it cannot reveal whether he felt relieved, tired, or uncertain. The evidence stays factual because it has no other choice. When officers later reconstructed the weekend, they had to work backwards through memories that were never formed for an investigation. A receptionist remembered a quiet guest, a clerk recalled a purchase, and drivers tried to place one passenger among many. You can appreciate how difficult that work becomes when nothing seemed unusual at the time. Memory has texture and warmth, but its edges soften quickly, like fingerprints fading from polished glass. Bergmann's accent offered one possible direction, although witness descriptions of accents are rarely exact enough to establish a birthplace. Several people thought he sounded German or Austrian, and his clothing included brands commonly sold across parts of continental Europe. Those details supported a broad regional impression, not a particular city or family. As we listen to the remembered voice through written statements, its actual tone has already been lost. He may have chosen Vienna because he knew it well, because it sounded plausible, or because it was comfortably distant from Sligo. The false address might contain a misspelling, a deliberate invention, or fragments of a real place rearranged beyond recognition. Investigators checked it and found no home belonging to the man in the photographs. You run your finger beneath the written line, aware that even false information can preserve some private association. The surname Bergmann is common enough in German-speaking countries to offer concealment without sounding invented. It means a miner or mountain man in its older linguistic roots, though that doesn't tell us why he selected it. The first name Peter is equally ordinary, easy to pronounce in several languages, and unlikely to invite questions at a hotel desk. Together, the words created a quiet, serviceable identity for 3 nights. There was also a real physicist named Peter Bergmann, known for his work with Albert Einstein, but no evidence connects that historical figure to the traveler's choice. A familiar name can settle unnoticed in memory through a newspaper, a book, a colleague, or an old conversation. It may then return years later when a person needs something to write on a form. You can note the coincidence without asking it to carry more weight than it deserves. This restraint is part of sitting patiently with the file, because mysteries invite the mind to turn every loose thread into a pattern. Yet a careful investigator separates what happened from what might have happened, placing each in a different mental drawer. Peter Bergmann bought 8 stamps, gave a false Austrian address, and repeatedly carried a purple bag from his hotel. Beyond those facts, the paper grows thin. On Saturday and Sunday, his movements continued through the quiet center of Sligo, sometimes beneath cameras and sometimes beyond them. The streets around Quay Street were compact enough to cover on foot, with shop windows close to the pavement and the river nearby. You can walk those routes in imagination at the same measured pace, hearing traffic soften after each junction. Somewhere along them, the bag's contents seem to have left his possession. If he used public bins, he may have divided the objects so that no single discovery could explain him completely. That possibility fits the repeated departures, but it isn't the only reasonable reading of what appears on camera. He could have carried purchases, papers, food, or other temporary items whose disposal meant little beyond ordinary use. We keep the question open because certainty applied too early can become another kind of blindness. Still, the absence of labels from the clothing later examined gave detectives reason to think anonymity had been cultivated. Manufacturer and size labels had been removed from several garments, leaving cut edges where soft tags would normally sit against the skin. You can imagine an evidence room table beneath fluorescent light, each item unfolded carefully upon clean paper. The small missing rectangles made silence feel almost tangible. Labels can identify a shop, a country of sale, a manufacturing batch, or at least the system of sizing used in a region. Their removal narrowed the routes available to investigators, although some clothing could still be associated with familiar European brands. A black leather jacket and navy trousers were linked with C&A, while other items offered their own limited clues. Each clue remained broad, like a road sign pointing toward an entire continent. The physical act of removing labels also raises questions that the file cannot answer. Some people cut them away because they itch, because they dislike branding, or because old seams have become uncomfortable against the neck. Others might remove them to hide where something was purchased. You look at the clipped threads and keep both ordinary habit and deliberate concealment within the same circle of possibility. There is compassion in allowing that uncertainty, because Peter Bergmann was a person before he became an unidentified case. He had preferences about clothing, likely knew the weight of his own keys, and carried memories no camera could preserve. Someone had once heard him laugh, watched him make tea, or recognized his step on a stairway. The file contains none of those intimate sounds, but their absence doesn't mean they never existed. By Sunday, the 14th of June, he had spent 2 nights at the Sligo City Hotel. His room would have gathered the faint, temporary signs of occupancy, perhaps a folded coat, a used glass, and the dry scent of tobacco lingering in fabric. Hotel staff remembered that he smoked frequently, and footage showed him stepping outside for cigarettes. You can imagine the paper warming between his fingers as the quiet town moved around him. That Sunday, he approached a taxi driver with a map and asked where he might find a pleasant, quiet beach where swimming was possible. The driver recommended Ross's Point, several miles from the center of Sligo, where the land opens toward the Atlantic. Bergmann accepted the suggestion and traveled there to look at the place. We follow the taxi now, away from the close streets and toward wider light. Ross's Point lies where the harbor meets the open sea, with broad views, changing tides, and mountains resting along the horizon. On a calm day, you can hear small waves flattening over the sand and gulls calling above the water. Salt gathers on the wind, leaving a cool trace on the lips, while grass bends along the roadside. For Bergmann, the journey appears to have been an inspection rather than a final arrival. He spent only a short time looking at the beach before returning in the same taxi. The driver took him back toward the bus station, and their conversation seems to have remained practical and restrained. Later, that question about a quiet place would feel significant, but at the time, it was merely a tourist asking local advice. You sit with the driver's memory and hear the engine idling beneath their few words. The map matters because it shows Bergmann was orienting himself, even if we cannot know how unfamiliar Sligo truly was to him. Perhaps he had visited years before and needed only a reminder, or perhaps every road was new. His measured trip to Ross's Point allowed him to see the distance, the shoreline, and the available bus service. The act was calm enough to pass without alarm. When he returned to town, the hotel still offered its ordinary shelter, and his final night there continued without any documented disturbance. Doors opened and closed along the corridor, plumbing murmured behind walls, and late daylight thinned against the curtains. You can place the purple bag near the bed, though we don't know where it actually rested. By then, its contents may already have been greatly reduced. Investigators would later study all 13 departures, comparing the apparent fullness of the bag and the time elapsed before each return. Surveillance work of this kind requires long attention to movements that look almost identical at first. A sleeve shifts, a handle becomes visible, and a shadow might be mistaken for an object. You can feel the dry archive air as another recording rewinds with a soft mechanical click. Digital images from that period were often less clear than present-day viewers expect, especially after being copied or enlarged. Faces could blur with motion, colors could shift under indoor lighting, and small objects lost definition as pixels spread across a screen. The bag's purple color remained memorable, yet its markings weren't distinct enough to trace a retailer. It was specific to the eye and frustratingly general to the investigation. A recovered carrier might have held fibers, fingerprints, receipts, dust, or residue from the places it had traveled. Without the physical object, none of those quiet examinations could begin. No technician could turn it beneath a bright lamp, seal it inside evidence packaging, or photograph the worn areas around its handles. For detectives, the bag remained evidence they could observe, but never touch. That difference is worth resting with for a moment, because an image and an object ask different kinds of questions. An image tells you where something appeared and how it moved through a measured slice of time. An object can tell you how it was made, what pressed against it, and perhaps whose hands held it. Peter Bergmann's purple bag offered the first kind of knowledge while withholding the second. There may also be a gentler reason why no one has ever claimed it as familiar. Reusable bags are rarely remembered with the precision given to jewelry. a coat, or a suitcase used for many years. Even a relative who recognized Bergmann's face might not recall which bag he carried on an ordinary shopping trip. You glance at the bags folded in your own cupboards and understand how easily their histories become anonymous. Yet, the color keeps drawing us back, because it gives the investigation one warm, visual detail among so many grey recordings. Purple moves through the hotel entrance, disappears along a street, and returns as an absence beside the man's dark clothing. It creates a repeated rhythm without revealing the purpose behind that rhythm. You can watch it 13 times and still finish with the same patient question. On Monday, the 15th of June, Peter Bergmann prepared to leave the Sligo City Hotel. Shortly after 1 in the afternoon, at 6 minutes past the hour, he returned his room key at reception. The transaction closed the 3-night stay, purchased with cash, leaving staff with a completed form and an invented address. You hear the key touch the counter, a small hard sound within the ordinary hotel quiet. His luggage had changed since the first clear images of his arrival. Reports noted that the original carry-on case was no longer with him, while another black piece of luggage appeared in its place. He also carried the black shoulder bag and, once more, the purple plastic carrier. You compare the still images carefully, looking at seams, handles, and proportions as though the bags themselves might remember more. A changed suitcase could suggest a purchase, an exchange, or an error caused by the imperfect quality of the footage. It might also belong to the same gradual removal of identifying possessions that investigators believed they were seeing. No recovered receipt settled the matter, and no shopkeeper was able to supply the missing history. The most honest note in your margin remains a quiet uncertainty. After checking out, Bergmann walked to the bus station and spent time there with his luggage. A witness remembered him eating a toasted ham and cheese sandwich and drinking coffee. Another ordinary meal, preserved because the hours afterward became important. You can imagine the warm bread, the paper wrapping, and the bitter smell rising from the cup. Around him, buses arrived and departed beneath illuminated timetable boards. At the station, he also read pieces of paper and tore some of them into smaller fragments. Accounts describe him placing the pieces into a nearby bin, one of the few moments when disposal was noticed directly. Investigators couldn't reconstruct the pages or determine whether they contained travel details, private writing, or nothing personally revealing. We see the careful movement of his hands, but the words themselves are gone. Paper is one of the lightest forms of evidence, and among the easiest to lose before anyone knows it matters. A timetable can be folded into a pocket, a receipt can soften beneath rain, and a handwritten address can vanish during routine cleaning. You sit beside the imagined bin with no authority to stop the passing hours. By the time the case existed, the station had already continued through another day. Bergmann waited for the late afternoon bus to Ross's Point, carrying his remaining luggage into the mild June light. The route he had inspected by taxi the previous day now became the last confirmed journey of the man using that name. There was no rush visible in the surviving account, and no public disturbance marked his departure. We move with him at the pace of the bus, as Sligo's buildings recede behind the glass. The road opened gradually toward the coast, where the air grew cooler and the Atlantic light spread across the fields. His bags rested nearby, including the purple carrier whose known history was almost finished. Other passengers may have looked past him without fixing his face in memory, as people do during countless local journeys. You can hear the low engine and the occasional soft hiss of the doors. He arrived at Ross's Point carrying the objects that remained, but the later record would preserve only some of them. The luggage itself wasn't found beside him the next morning, and no document established where it went after he left public view. Whatever was inside the purple bag passed into the same blank interval. The camera sequence had ended, while the careful work of understanding it had not yet begun. That evening, several people saw an older man walking near the strand, though recollections varied in their detail. The shoreline offered long stretches of pale sand, low water, and stones darkened by the tide. You can feel the cool wind moving through your coat and hear the regular folding of small waves. Nothing in that landscape carried a label, a passport, or a name the investigators could later read. As daylight lingered, the man's final belongings became separated from any account capable of explaining them. Some clothing was found near the shore, with labels removed, while the bags seen earlier weren't recovered there. The absence would lead officers back into Sligo, back through the hotel footage, and repeatedly back to the purple carrier. Each return to the recordings began with the same silent walk. The following morning would bring the unknown man formally into the care of the authorities, and the file would change from a search through movements into a search for identity. Before we reach that morning, you can remain for a while with the empty hotel corridor, where the camera keeps recording after its subject has gone. The carpet lies still beneath the electric light, and the reception desk receives other keys, other names, and other travelers whose addresses lead reliably home. And before the town had fully awakened, the tide at Ross's Point had already begun its slow exchange with the shore. The 16th of June arrived beneath a cool sky, with early light spreading across sand still dark from the night. A father and son came to the beach shortly before 7, moving through the clean morning air while much of Sligo remained quiet. It was there, at about 7:15, that they found the unknown man called Peter Bergmann. The discovery brought Garda officers to the strand, where the sea continued its mild, repetitive motion beyond the gathered figures. You can imagine the first notes being written while wind lifted the edges of a small notebook and salt settled faintly upon every surface. There was no identification beside the man, and none of the available belongings supplied an immediate name. The case therefore began under a plain description, an unidentified male found at Ross's Point. Those first words were practical rather than mysterious, because practical language gives investigators somewhere stable to begin. A location is marked, a time is recorded, and each visible item is preserved before memory or weather can alter it. You stand quietly with the officers as they measure the beach against fixed features, hearing gulls above the low sound of water. Patient detective work often starts with such ordinary acts of placement. Several items of clothing were found nearby, resting among rocks along the shoreline, rather than arranged as a complete set of possessions. There were dark garments, socks, shoes, and other pieces that could be compared with the man seen on cameras around Sligo. The fabric would have felt cool and slightly damp in the morning air, its folds holding grains of pale sand. You begin, as the officers did, with what can be handled. The black leather shoes were made by Finn Comfort a German company, and carried a European size of 44. Records later indicated that the shoes had been manufactured in Germany during 2002, several years before the journey to Sligo. Their soles showed use, though shoes seldom preserve a readable map of every pavement they've crossed. You can turn them beneath the evidence room light and see only a broad continental clue. There was also a black leather jacket associated with C and A, along with navy chino trousers from the same widely distributed retailer. A black sleeveless Tommy Hilfiger jumper and a black leather belt marked Key West, USA, formed part of the recovered clothing. Dark socks completed the quiet collection, each item familiar enough to belong in thousands of wardrobes. The garments suggested where someone might have shopped, but not which particular person had worn them. Most importantly, identifying labels had been cut from the clothing with notable care. Small seams remained where fabric tags had once given sizes, production details, washing instructions, or countries of manufacture. You can imagine the slight roughness beneath a fingertip, a clipped line that ended just before the surrounding cloth. Whether removed for comfort or anonymity, those absent labels narrowed the investigators' reach. The purple carrier seen so often at the Sligo City Hotel wasn't among the objects catalogued from Ross's Point. Neither was the luggage that accompanied Bergmann after he checked out on the previous afternoon. The beach offered clothing, but no passport, wallet, family photograph, medicine bottle, or letter capable of carrying officers directly toward a home. You look across the evidence table and notice how much of its meaning lies in what isn't there. This absence did not prove that every personal possession had been deliberately destroyed, although the repeated journeys with the purple bag made that explanation understandable. Luggage can be left behind, misplaced, taken, or stored somewhere investigators never think to search. A carrier bag can fold into almost nothing and disappear within routine refuse. We keep each possibility at a respectful distance, without forcing the evidence to choose before it is ready. The initial work at the beach was followed by the quieter work of identification, which often begins long before any broad public appeal. Officers checked recent reports of missing people and circulated the man's description through available channels. They compared age, height, clothing, dental features, and the location where he had been found. You can hear telephones ringing in adjoining offices as one unanswered inquiry leads patiently to another. No missing person report in the immediate area supplied a convincing match. The man hadn't carried an Irish identity document, and his fingerprints didn't correspond with records available to investigators. A face can be clear enough for a photograph, yet remain unrecognized by every person asked to view it. That was the first enduring difficulty in the Peter Bergmann case, and it settled over the file with unusual quietness. But there was another part of the file to open, because a careful medical examination could describe the life of the body, even when it couldn't provide the name. The examination took place at Sligo General Hospital on Wednesday, the 17th of June, under the care of state pathologist Dr. Clive Kilgallen. The room would have been cool, brightly lit, and orderly, with stainless surfaces and the low background sounds of hospital ventilation. You can remain at the edge of that work, concerned not with distressing detail, but with the medical history it revealed. The findings spoke of prolonged and serious illness, Bergmann had advanced prostate cancer, and the disease had spread through his body over a considerable period. He also had significant heart disease and evidence of earlier cardiac damage, suggesting health problems that couldn't have begun during his short stay in Ireland. One kidney was absent, most likely through an operation performed at another time in his life. You read these findings as fragments of an unwritten medical record. The missing kidney was especially important because surgery creates records, appointments, bills, and memories among clinical staff. Somewhere, perhaps in Austria, Germany, or another country entirely, a surgeon may once have spoken with this man beneath the soft light of a hospital room. Nurses may have changed dressings, and a receptionist may have typed his real name into a database. Yet, no known inquiry succeeded in connecting those distant records with the unidentified traveler in Sligo. His condition would likely have caused discomfort, fatigue, and an awareness that his health was failing. Witnesses had noticed that he moved with some difficulty, but he didn't ask those around him for medical help. No regular prescription medicine was found among his belongings, despite illnesses for which treatment or pain relief might ordinarily be expected. You can hold that detail gently, because suffering often remains private, even among people who are well known. The medical evidence supported the conclusion that he had experienced a heart attack near the end of his life. Reports also considered the circumstances of the shoreline and the possibility of immersion, though there was no indication that another person had caused his death. Gardaí found no evidence of foul play, and the investigation centered instead upon establishing his identity. The unanswered question was not who harmed him, but who he had once been. That change in emphasis gives the Peter Bergmann case its distinctive, patient character. Detectives weren't searching for a hidden attacker or reconstructing a confrontation, but trying to return a name to a person who seemed to have removed every convenient route toward it. You sit beside them, with the medical report beneath your hand, the paper smooth and slightly cool. It contains intimate truths about his health, while leaving his ordinary life blank. An old operation can sometimes function like a signature, especially when a procedure is uncommon or leaves a distinctive clinical pattern. Investigators could ask hospitals about patients matching his approximate age, background, and surgical history. But such searches face practical limits across national borders. Medical confidentiality, inconsistent record systems, and incomplete dates all slow the process. You can almost hear filing cabinets opening in offices far from the Atlantic coast. There was no reliable date for the kidney operation, and no confirmed country where it had occurred. The scar could show that a procedure had taken place, but not the language spoken by the surgeon or the name printed above the hospital bed. Even a well-maintained archive needs enough precise information to begin its search. Here, the detectives held a medical event without its place in time. Dental work provided another possible path, since witnesses remembered a noticeable gold tooth, and examiners could document restorations unique to the man. Teeth often outlast documents, and dental charts have identified unknown people when photographs and fingerprints have failed. Yet the method depends upon locating a dentist's corresponding record or a relative who knows where treatment occurred. You turn through the diagrams and find careful marks, but no matching chart. His dental care appeared consistent with work available across much of Europe, rather than one rare technique pointing toward a particular town. A gold restoration might be remembered by friends, but only if those friends saw the appeal and recognized the face beside it. National boundaries, languages, and the uneven reach of news all stood between the image and that moment of recognition. The clue remained solid, visible, and frustratingly broad. The same was true of his physical description. He stood a little under 6 feet, with a slender build and closely cut grey hair, and he was believed to be in his 60s. His eyes were blue, his complexion fair, and his accent seemed to place him somewhere in German-speaking Europe. You can assemble those details into a likeness, though many lives could fit comfortably within their outline. Investigators took fingerprints and preserved a DNA sample, providing future work with evidence more precise than visual memory. At the time, those records could be compared against police and missing person systems available in Ireland and abroad. No match returned with the real name of Peter Bergmann or anyone else. The databases answered only with their own administrative silence. A missing match doesn't mean that a person lived without records, because most ordinary lives leave no fingerprints in criminal databases. DNA systems in 2009 were also far narrower than the tools familiar today, particularly for searching distant family connections. If Bergmann had never been arrested and no close relatives' profile was available for comparison, the search could end without recognition. You note that limitation beside the word negative. Negative findings accumulate differently from positive ones. A match creates a direction, while a non-match removes only one possible route among thousands. Detectives can check Ireland, then continental systems, then international notices, and still know that many private archives remain untouched. You feel the weight of those separate searches as folders gather softly at the corners of the desk. The medical findings also altered how investigators understood Bergmann's behavior during the final days. A person with advanced illness may make deliberate arrangements, reduce belongings, or travel toward a place holding personal meaning. That possibility fits several known facts, yet it doesn't establish why he chose Sligo or Ross's Point. We can recognize a pattern without claiming access to the private reasoning behind it. Perhaps the coast was familiar from an earlier journey, or perhaps he had only read about it and selected it from a map. He might have chosen Western Ireland for its distance, its quietness, or the ordinary anonymity offered to a summer traveller. The taxi driver's recommendation may have been his first introduction to Ross's Point itself. You look at the folded map and leave room for both memory and chance. There is something deeply human in preparing for a journey while carrying an illness that others cannot see. Tickets must still be purchased, rooms found, and small meals chosen, even when the future has become very short. Bergmann completed these tasks with enough calm to avoid concern from almost everyone he encountered. His privacy traveled beside him like another piece of luggage. When officers learned that the man had stayed at the Sligo City Hotel, the scattered observations began forming a coherent sequence. Staff supplied the registration details, room information, payment method, and memories of his reserved manner. Surveillance recordings placed him at entrances and corridors throughout the weekend. You can imagine investigators arranging times on paper, drawing a slow line from Friday evening to Monday afternoon. The false Austrian address became an immediate focus, because even a slightly mistaken street might lead to neighbors or municipal records. Checks found that the information didn't correspond with a valid residence capable of identifying him. The postal number was inconsistent with the Vienna location he had written, adding another layer of uncertainty. A line of ink that looked complete at reception became almost unusable under examination. Handwriting itself offered little. The hotel card preserved the motion of his hand, but there was no confirmed sample under another name for comparison. Letter shapes may hint at education or habit, though such interpretations are rarely strong enough to identify a person alone. You study the slant and spacing, hearing again the imagined scratch of the pen across the form. Cash payment prevented investigators from following a bank transaction back to an account. There was no card number, electronic authorization, or printed statement waiting in another country. The money had moved from his hand to the hotel without carrying personal information between them. In the quiet economy of the case, cash served him with complete neutrality. His journey by public transport created similar limits. Tickets purchased without identification could establish a route while revealing nothing about the passenger's legal name. Cameras showed him at the Derry depot and later in Sligo, but they didn't show where his longer journey began. You place the two towns on a map, separated by roads and a border. Then notice how many railways, ferries, and airports lie beyond the edges. Derry offered another collection of recordings and potential witnesses, though no earlier accommodation or confirmed arrival point was tied securely to him. He seemed simply to appear at the bus depot during the afternoon of the 12th. Perhaps he had arrived by another bus, walked from a lodging, or travelled through Northern Ireland under details never connected to the appeal. The trail grew faint precisely where investigators most needed it to become clearer. Officers circulated his image, hoping that a hotel worker, ticket clerk, or fellow passenger might remember him elsewhere. Recognition can depend upon surprisingly small things, including the way someone holds a cigarette or folds a coat over one arm. Yet days become weeks, and the faces passing through transport terminals blend together. You can feel the difficulty of asking memory to preserve one quiet traveler without knowing it should have been watching. The search also reached police organizations outside Ireland, where descriptions, fingerprints, and photographs could be compared with existing files. Austria and Germany were natural areas of interest because of his accent and the address supplied at the hotel. Interpol channels widened the inquiry, but no agency returned a confirmed identity. Peter Bergmann remained an alias, spoken over desks in several countries. Language presented a subtle complication because a Germanic accent doesn't necessarily reveal citizenship or birthplace. Someone raised in one nation may live for decades in another, while regional dialects can soften when speaking a second language. Witnesses heard only brief English exchanges, not an extended conversation in German. You listen through their recollections and understand why the sound couldn't be pinned neatly to a map. His clothing also crossed borders easily. C&A operated stores in many European countries, while Tommy Hilfiger and Finn Comfort products travelled far beyond their places of manufacture. A German-made shoe might be bought in Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands, or through a retailer elsewhere. The material evidence suggested continental connections, but modern commerce had already loosened those threads. Even the cigarettes offered no firm direction. Bergmann smoked frequently, according to witnesses and surviving footage, yet no distinctive tobacco packaging remained to identify a national market. A brand might have narrowed the search slightly if recovered, though travelers often buy cigarettes wherever they happen to be. You watch him stand beyond the hotel doors, smoke lifting into the damp Sligo air. The purple bag returned repeatedly during the review because it seemed to represent deliberate activity beyond the reach of the cameras. Detectives counted the departures and compared each return, searching for any frame that revealed the contents or their destination. 13 journeys suggested a process rather than a single errand, although the exact number depends upon how the footage was interpreted. You sit through the repetitions, letting each sequence unfold without haste. At one moment, the bag appears rounded and full, pressing outward against its handles. Later, the man returns with his hands free, his coat hanging naturally at his sides. Between those images lies a stretch of town that the camera cannot supply. The absence is only a few minutes, or perhaps longer, but it contains the answer to one of the case's most persistent questions. Officers checked bins and disposal points where possible, yet routine collections had already carried much away. A town produces an enormous volume of paper, packaging, food waste, and discarded household objects during an ordinary summer weekend. Sorting that material after the fact would require knowing where and when a particular item entered the stream. By then, the purple bag's possible contents had dissolved into a larger municipal current. You might wonder whether he posted anything using the stamps purchased on Saturday, thereby sending identifying material beyond Sligo rather than throwing it away. Investigators had no confirmed letters to trace, and postal privacy offered no easy list of destinations. An envelope could cross Europe, bearing only a handwritten address and stamps bought with cash. It might arrive quietly on someone's mat, understood by its recipient and never recognized as evidence. That possibility has always carried a gentle human weight. If he wrote final letters, someone may have read them beside a kitchen window while the investigation continued elsewhere. The recipient might have honored a request for privacy, failed to connect the message with Irish news, or believed the writer had simply gone away. We cannot know whether those letters existed, so we leave their imagined paper unopened. The 8 stamps might instead have been intended for postcards, documents, or correspondence never completed. They may have been discarded among the papers torn at the bus station. Small purchases often appear more purposeful in retrospect than they felt at the time. You record the transaction carefully, then resist filling the empty envelopes with words of your own making. Patient detectives return often to this discipline, separating possibility from proof whenever a case begins attracting stories. The facts of Peter Bergmann's final days are unusual enough without adding secret professions, hidden fortunes, or elaborate international plots. Nothing in the known evidence established that he had worked in intelligence or fled criminal activity. His behavior is also compatible with a private, seriously ill man seeking to disappear from ordinary records. Compatibility isn't certainty, of course, and the file doesn't reveal why anonymity mattered so deeply to him. He may have wished to protect relatives from knowledge, avoid costs, escape shame, or retain control over the final part of his life. There could also have been reasons investigators never imagined. You give each possibility a little room, but none receives the authority of a fact. The lack of medication raises similarly quiet questions. Advanced cancer and heart disease would ordinarily bring appointments, prescriptions, and perhaps a familiar pharmacy. He may have stopped treatment before traveling, disposed of medicine in the purple bag, or never received consistent care. The medical report shows what his body carried, while the hotel footage may show him removing the records associated with that care. A prescription label could have identified a doctor, clinic, or home address with a single printed line. A medicine packet might carry a national language or dispensing mark, narrowing the search considerably. If such objects were among the bag's contents, their loss explains part of the lasting difficulty. You can picture them briefly beneath the translucent purple plastic, though the image remains only a thoughtful possibility. So too might there have been family photographs, membership cards, keys, or a wallet bearing worn impressions from years of use. The contents could have included very little or almost everything that connected him to his former life. The repeated fullness of the carrier suggests material of some volume, but grainy footage cannot provide a reliable inventory. What it shows is weight, without giving that weight a name. Keys would have been especially valuable because their shapes and markings sometimes identify manufacturers, locks, vehicles, or institutions. A single loyalty card could have pointed toward a neighborhood supermarket, while a library slip might have narrowed the search to one town. Cold cases often turn on objects that once seemed too ordinary to notice. Here, ordinary things may have vanished before anyone understood their value. The luggage itself could have held further clues through repair labels, airline tags, fibers, or personal packing habits. Yet, the cases seen at the hotel and bus station weren't recovered in a way that allowed forensic study. Their disappearance widened the blank space surrounding the purple carrier. You turn another photographic print beneath the lamp, tracing the dark outline of a handle against the lighter station floor. Investigators had to consider whether someone else collected the luggage after Bergmann reached Ross's Point. No meeting was captured, and no witness reliably described him handing property to another person. He wasn't seen using a telephone to arrange a collection during his stay. The possibility couldn't be excluded completely, but the surviving evidence offered it very little support. It was more likely, in the view of many who studied the case, that he continued disposing of belongings until almost nothing identifying remained. The method would have required persistence rather than complicated expertise, using public bins and unobserved spaces available in any town. You can walk a short route, discard one object, fold the bag, and return without drawing attention. Repeated quietly, the process could remove an entire portable history. His apparent success owed as much to timing as to planning. No one was searching for him while the bins were being emptied, and no alert had asked hotel staff to preserve every object from his room. The investigation began only after his final trip to the coast. By then, ordinary systems had cleaned corridors, processed refuse, and carried travelers onward according to their usual schedules. The hotel room itself was examined, but it yielded no decisive personal document. A guest who pays cash and removes his belongings leaves behind surfaces shared by many others, along with traces difficult to interpret without a known comparison. Housekeeping routines can also erase the small disorder of a stay before it acquires investigative importance. You can smell detergent in the quiet room, where fresh linen has already replaced whatever warmth remained there. Receipts might have revealed meals, shops, or travel points, yet none reconstructed a longer identity. Any coins in his possession belonged to a shared currency, used across many countries. His clothing sizes helped describe him, but didn't locate him. The file became an accumulation of accurate details, whose combined direction remained strangely wide. In the weeks following the discovery, Gardai issued appeals through newspapers and broadcasts, using the available photographs and physical description. Local people were asked whether they had seen the man or knew where he stayed before reaching Sligo. The public response produced observations, but none established a real name. You can imagine copies of his picture lying beneath coffee cups in offices and newsrooms, their edges beginning to curl. A photograph asks a simple question that can be surprisingly difficult to answer. Do you know this face? And if so, from where? Someone may resemble a retired neighbor, a former customer, or a man glimpsed each morning on a train, without being that person at all. Investigators must check each good faith suggestion slowly, comparing dates, records, and physical details. Recognition is valuable only when it can be confirmed. Potential names were considered and excluded. Missing person files were reviewed, contacts made, and families spared false certainty whenever the details failed to align. This work rarely appears in brief accounts of the case, because a disproved lead leaves little narrative behind. Yet, you can feel the hours inside it, each one spent ensuring that the unidentified man wasn't someone another family had been seeking in silence. The inquiry continued for roughly 5 months in its concentrated initial phase. 5 months means changing weather over Sligo, from June's long evenings toward darker autumn afternoons, while the same folder remained active on a detective's desk. Calls became less frequent, and the earliest memories grew less exact. Still, the work continued with a patient, procedural steadiness. Detective Inspector John O'Reilly oversaw the investigation in the Sligo and Leitrim division. He and his colleagues assembled the footage, witness statements, medical findings, and international checks into the most complete account available. What they possessed was unusually detailed for a man without a name, covering several days, almost hour by hour. You can feel the thickness of that file and the paradox within its pages. They knew when he arrived in Sligo, where he slept, what he paid, and which beach he asked to visit. They knew he bought 8 stamps, ate a toasted sandwich, smoked often, and carried a purple bag through the hotel entrance. They knew about his heart, kidney, cancer, shoes, jacket, belt, and clipped clothing labels. Yet the most ordinary facts of his life remained beyond reach. No confirmed birth date appeared. No employer, spouse, sibling, child, or friend was found. There was no known language in which someone had called him by his real first name. You turn from the detailed weekend timeline to the blank personal history, and the contrast feels almost like moving from a brightly lit room into a dim corridor. This is why the bag continued to occupy investigators and later observers. It offered a visible mechanism by which those missing facts might have been carried away, one small load at a time, if personal papers left the hotel inside it. then the solution may once have passed within feet of a functioning camera. The lens preserved the container, while failing to preserve what mattered inside. Yet detectives couldn't treat the bag itself as proof of his intentions. No recovered note stated that he wished to remain unidentified, and no witness heard him explain his actions. The pattern strongly suggested deliberate concealment, but the private reasons died with the identity he withheld. You can write the word intentional in pencil, leaving enough room to soften it if new evidence ever appears. The same caution applied to his travel route. His Germanic accent and Austrian claim encouraged inquiries towards Central Europe. But he could have lived elsewhere for many years. He might have been a German speaker from northern Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, or a family community farther east. Accents travel with people, then change slowly through work, marriage, and migration. The voice remembered in Sligo may have carried several places at once. European history also created generations whose documents and residence didn't align neatly with birthplace. A man of Bergmann's estimated age may have grown up amid post-war movement, changing borders, divided nations, or family displacement. None of that can be assigned to him without evidence. But it explains why a regional accent needn't yield one national archive. You let the map remain broad beneath your hand. The missing kidney might have linked him to a health system, although records from earlier decades weren't always digitized or easily searchable across borders. Paper files could sit in hospital basements under local patient numbers, inaccessible without a surname and date of birth. Some may have been destroyed under retention rules long before Irish investigators knew to ask. You can almost feel the cool archive air and smell old cardboard beneath fluorescent tubes. A surgeon who remembered the case might already have retired. Nurses could have moved, and clinics might have merged or closed, even if a photograph circulated in Ireland. It may never have reached the particular waiting room where his face was once familiar. The failure of recognition often reflects the distance between records rather than the absence of records themselves. Patient investigation must learn to live with that distance. Dental files face the same problem. In many countries, records remain with individual practices and cannot be searched through a single central system. Without a suspected name or locality, a chart may exist perfectly preserved yet remain functionally invisible. You picture a narrow drawer opening somewhere in Europe, filled with envelopes labeled alphabetically under the identity investigators never learned. The matching diagram sleeps inside one of them, untouched and quiet. Fingerprints offered broader comparison, but only against databases containing fingerprints for some prior reason. An ordinary worker, parent, or pensioner could reach old age without ever entering such a system. A negative search, therefore, said little about character and much about the limits of available collections. You close the fingerprint report, knowing it eliminated no peaceful, unrecorded life. DNA held more promise for future methods, but in 2009, its immediate use was chiefly comparative. Investigators could match a sample to a known relative or an existing forensic profile, but they couldn't simply ask it to produce a name. The large consumer genealogy networks that would later reshape cold case work were not yet used in the familiar way. For the moment, the sample waited in controlled storage, carrying exact biological information without an address. Waiting is one of the central activities in a cold case office. Evidence is sealed, indexed, and placed where time cannot damage it quickly, while methods outside the building continue to improve. A sample that offers no answer today may become useful after databases expand or legal policies change. You can hear the evidence room door closing softly, not as an ending, but as an act of preservation. The photographs waited too. Surveillance stills could be enhanced, reproduced, and shown again whenever public attention returned to the case. Yet the clearer the image became, the more striking the lack of recognition seemed. His face wasn't concealed in Sligo, and he moved through public spaces without disguise. He removed names from objects, but not the ordinary features by which another person might know him. Perhaps he believed the distance from home would be enough. Local Irish coverage might never reach a small continental town, especially before stories circulated instantly across international social media. A family could assume he had chosen to leave, while officials in another country held no report linking his absence to Sligo. You consider how national borders can separate two halves of the same unanswered question. There may not have been a family able to report him missing. He might have lived alone, become estranged, or maintained relationships that allowed long periods without contact. Workplaces sometimes assume an older colleague has retired or moved, while neighbors interpret an empty flat according to whatever explanation seems least intrusive. A missing life can be quietly misread when no one person holds the entire pattern. Another possibility is that someone did recognize the public description, but chose not to speak. They may have understood his wishes, feared unwanted attention, or doubted their own certainty after seeing a grainy image. Silence can arise from care as well as indifference, and from confusion as readily as secrecy. You allow those human motives to remain complex, because the file cannot simplify them. During the initial investigation, officers also searched for evidence that Bergmann had interacted with another person in Sligo. The camera footage showed no sustained meeting, and witnesses recalled only brief service encounters. He appeared to move alone through the hotel, post office, station, taxis, and streets. The purple bag was his most constant visible companion. This solitude may be one reason the case feels so intimate when reviewed late at night. We follow one person through ordinary civic spaces, seeing him clearly enough to notice his habits, but never closely enough to know his thoughts. You sit beside the camera operator as he leaves another frame, aware that no second figure steps forward to explain him. The town contains many people, yet his journey remains almost entirely private. The Garda investigation didn't treat that privacy as wrongdoing. There was no evidence that Bergmann had committed a crime in Sligo, and the medical findings didn't point toward violence by another person. Identifying him was an act of public duty and human dignity, not a hunt for punishment. You can sense that distinction in the careful language of later appeals, which asked simply for someone who knew his name. A name would have allowed notification of relatives and completion of records that otherwise remained provisional. It might also have explained the journey, though identification doesn't always answer every question behind a person's choices. Even if his home were found, the purple bag's contents could remain unknown. Solving one layer of a case doesn't guarantee that all its quieter mysteries will open. For now, however, every layer remained closed. The hotel name was false. The Vienna address led nowhere, and international comparisons produced no match. The belongings recovered at Ross's Point described a European man of mature years without locating him inside any particular community. You place each report back into its folder, feeling the slight resistance of paper against the metal fastener. As summer moved into autumn, the concentrated inquiry gradually became a long-term unidentified person case. This didn't mean that concern ended or that the evidence was forgotten. It meant the immediate routes had been traveled without arriving at a confirmed name, and new work would depend upon fresh information. The file entered a slower kind of time. In that slower time, detectives could revisit footage whenever a possible lead emerged. They could compare another missing man's photograph, age, height, medical history, and date of disappearance against what was known in Sligo. Most comparisons would end quietly, perhaps after a telephone call or the arrival of a record by post. You rarely hear about those endings because careful elimination makes almost no sound. The purple bag couldn't be retested because it wasn't there, but its image could be reviewed again under better viewing conditions. Investigators might adjust contrast, enlarge a frame, or compare it with commercial bags known from European shops. Color reproduction remained unreliable, and no clear wording or emblem appeared. What looked purple beneath one camera's light might have been violet, plum, or blue under another. That uncertainty matters when an object's color becomes part of its public identity. Witnesses and viewers begin remembering the phrase, purple bag, more strongly than the indistinct carrier shown in the footage. Over time, the description can feel more exact than the image that produced it. You return to the original frame whenever possible, keeping the pixels separate from the story built around them. Was it one durable bag used repeatedly, or several similar bags brought from the hotel room? Accounts often describe a single carrier, yet the footage couldn't always prove continuity between departures. A reusable bag might be folded and returned in a coat pocket, ready to be filled again. Alternatively, he could have possessed a small stack of them. We mark the distinction because even a tiny uncertainty deserves a place in the file. If it was the same bag, its handles endured the weight of 13 outward journeys. The plastic would have creased repeatedly along familiar lines, growing softer each time it was folded. You can imagine the faint tack of its surface and the muted rustle against his dark coat. Such sensory details make the object feel close, although they cannot be verified from silent footage. If there were several bags, then their common color might point toward a shop or source, though no retailer was conclusively identified. Stores often change carrier designs, and a bag used in 2009 may no longer appear in surviving catalogs. Employees change, branches close, and packaging disappears without entering archives. A small commercial clue can age more quickly than official paperwork. Investigators also had to decide how widely to publicize the case. Too little attention might miss the one person capable of recognition, while broad speculation could bury useful facts beneath rumors. Appeals, therefore, returned to the stable details. The dates, the journey from Derry, the Sligo Hotel, the Germanic accent, and Ross's Point. You hear Peter Bergmann's adopted name repeated because it remains the only name available to say. The public gave the man other descriptions, including the Sligo man and the unknown traveler, but none could replace a legal identity. An alias at least connected every part of the timeline, from the registration card to the later appeals, it allowed the case to be discussed without reducing him to a number. Even a false name can offer a temporary measure of human shape. Months passed, and no family arrived at Sligo Garda station carrying a photograph from an earlier year. No former colleague called with a medical history matching the missing kidney and gold dental work. No landlord supplied a forwarding address, and no neighbor identified the black leather jacket. You can feel the office settling into winter, radiators warm beneath windows, while the same questions remain open. The body could not remain indefinitely within the hospital system while the search continued. Arrangements eventually had to be made for burial, despite the absence of relatives or a confirmed name. Public authorities assumed that responsibility, providing a place in Sligo where the unidentified man could rest. The administrative forms still carried the alias Peter Bergmann, enclosed in careful quotation marks. He was buried in Sligo Cemetery, in a plot provided through the Public Health Service. The grave didn't receive the full personal inscription that family knowledge might have supplied, because no birth date, hometown, or true surname could be confirmed. You can picture the cemetery under a soft western rain, grass darkening around rows of stone. His resting place became the one fixed address the investigation could give him. Burial didn't close the file. The preserved records, fingerprints, DNA, photographs, and medical findings remained available for comparison, while the grave ensured that any future legal or forensic need could be approached with care. A cold case often continues in this quiet double state, resting physically while remaining active on paper. You sit between those two forms of patience, the cemetery earth and the archive shelf. Years would pass before wider attention returned to Peter Bergmann and his purple bag. During that interval, Sligo changed in the ordinary ways towns do, with businesses opening, cameras being replaced, and staff moving into other work. The hotel continued receiving guests whose names could be checked and whose journeys led elsewhere. The old footage remained a captured pocket of June 2009. When a detective revisits such a recording after several years, the familiar movements can seem almost ritualized. Bergmann leaves through the entrance, the purple carrier full beside him, and the camera holds its fixed view after he disappears. Then he returns without a visible load, passing back into the private part of the hotel. You watch again, not because the pixels have changed, but because your questions may have become more precise. One viewing might focus upon his hands, another upon the shape of the bag, and another upon reflections in the glass behind him. Investigators can note whether his coat pocket appears fuller on return, perhaps suggesting the carrier was folded and retained. They can compare the timing with known rubbish collections or other cameras along possible routes. Each viewing extracts a little more structure from the same silent minutes. Still, an image cannot reveal an object hidden inside opaque plastic. Enhancement sharpens boundaries, but doesn't recover information the camera never captured. No software can turn a blurred surface into a readable document if the document was never visible. You accept this limit as part of patient work, where better tools remain bound by the original evidence's depth. The next meaningful shift came not from a newly recovered possession, but from people choosing to tell the story again. a documentary project began drawing together the footage, locations, and witness memories into a more widely accessible form. With time, the man's careful movements reached viewers far beyond Sligo. The purple bag passed once more beneath observation, now on screens in distant and darkened rooms. The film was called The Last Days of Peter Bergmann, and it appeared several years after the investigation's first concentrated months. Its approach lingered upon the ordinary geography of his final journey, allowing streets, corridors, and the coastline to carry much of the account. You could watch the town as investigators had watched it, through fragments connected by patient attention. The case acquired an audience without acquiring a name. People who had never visited Sligo began studying the same hotel images and wondering where the man had travelled from. Some recognized the shape of a European coat or thought they heard familiar regional qualities in descriptions of his accent. Others looked closely at the bag, hoping its color or construction might awaken a useful memory. Attention widened, but the circle around his identity remained unbroken. The documentary's appearance at international film festivals carried Peter Bergmann's image into countries the original local appeals may not have reached. Viewers in German-speaking regions could now see his face and posture more easily. Yet recognition still depended upon the right person encountering the material at the right time. You can scatter 1,000 images across the world and still miss one necessary pair of eyes. By then, the man would have been absent from his former life for several years. Apartments might have changed tenants, telephone numbers been reassigned, and workplaces reorganized. People who knew him could have moved or died without ever learning where his last journey ended. Time expands public reach, while quietly weakening private memory, and an old investigation must work within both movements. The purple bag suffered a similar passage from evidence detail to enduring symbol. It came to represent the belongings that weren't found. The purple bag suffered a similar passage from evidence detail to enduring symbol. It came to represent the belongings that weren't found, the papers that couldn't be read, and the routes that disappeared between camera views. Yet it remained an ordinary carrier, whose exact contents and origin were unknown. You keep it at its proper size, resisting the temptation to make it larger than the person who held it. Another bridge in the file appeared as journalists returned to speak with retired or serving investigators. Their recollections clarified how thoroughly the footage had been reviewed and how unusual the lack of disposal images seemed. Not once did the available cameras plainly show Bergmann emptying the bag, despite recording him with it on repeated departures. The missing act remained hidden in the town's unobserved intervals. That fact sometimes encourages elaborate theories, but the physical explanation may be quite simple. CCTV systems protect entrances, tills, and building fronts rather than every public bin or narrow lane. A person walking for several minutes can pass through many spaces where no camera points. You draw the coverage on a street plan and watch the mystery shrink from impossibility into ordinary geography. What remains remarkable is his persistence. If he was removing identifying possessions, he appears to have done so gradually enough that no single container drew attention. He didn't abandon a suitcase in the hotel or leave a wallet beside the shore. The pattern suggests someone attending carefully to small practical details while seriously ill. You sense method, but not the reason beneath that method. Illness may have shaped the pace of those journeys as well. Carrying smaller loads would have been easier for a thin man with cardiac disease and advanced cancer than moving everything at once. Frequent pauses outside the hotel could have combined smoking with rest. A deliberate process needn't have been effortless, and the cameras may preserve more physical strain than their distant images allow us to see. The witnesses who met him described courtesy rather than agitation. He asked for directions, bought what he needed, and completed transactions without drawing concern. That calm surface doesn't tell us what he felt privately, but it does help us avoid imposing drama on his final days. You follow the evidence at the same measured tempo he seems to have kept through Sligo. Years later, the case still invited comparisons with other unidentified people found near coastlines, especially those who had removed clothing labels or used false hotel details. Comparisons can reveal useful investigative patterns, though they can also blur important differences between individual lives. Peter Bergmann's case must remain rooted in its own dates, places, and physical evidence. You return to Quay Street, the bus station, and Ross's Point whenever speculation drifts too far. The possible European origin remained one of the strongest broad directions. His accent, clothing, dental work, and false Vienna address all pointed generally toward the continent, though none selected a single jurisdiction. Renewed appeals could therefore be translated and shared among audiences in Austria, Germany, and neighboring countries. Each translation carried the same request across a different field of memory. Perhaps someone remembered the shape of his shoulders beneath a black jacket, or the gold tooth visible during conversation. Perhaps a doctor recalled a slender patient who had lost a kidney and later stopped attending appointments. Such recognition would need documents and DNA before becoming certainty. Still, cold case work often begins again with one person saying, quietly, that a face looks familiar, and so the later investigators prepared to open the file once more, lifting photographs from protective sleeves and placing the medical details beside newer possibilities. The cardboard would have softened at its corners by then, while printed pages carried the faint dry smell of years in storage. You draw the small lamp closer, because the next stage of the search belongs to changing technology, renewed appeals, and the evidence that had been waiting all along in silence. That silence did not mean the Peter Bergmann file had become empty, because preserved evidence continues to gather value while the world around it changes. A DNA sample remains the same molecule, yet the systems capable of interpreting it can become wider, faster, and more sensitive. Photographs do not gain new pixels, though they can reach new audiences. You begin this part of the inquiry with that quiet distinction between evidence that changes and opportunities that change. In the years after 2009, unidentified person investigations increasingly benefited from stronger international cooperation and more accessible digital records. Missing person notices, once stored in separate offices, could be compared across borders with less delay. Online circulation also allowed a face photographed in Ireland to appear before viewers in Austria or Germany within moments. The old Sligo case had entered a world of wider connection. Wider connection, however, doesn't guarantee the particular connection an investigation needs. A photograph may circulate among thousands of interested strangers while never reaching a former neighbor, cousin, or doctor. Algorithms can display a story widely without knowing which quiet household would understand it. You can feel the strange imbalance between enormous public attention and the single private memory that still remains absent. The documentary helped preserve witness voices before more time passed. Taxi drivers, hotel staff, and investigators could describe encounters in their own cadence, adding small human textures that formal reports tend to compress. A pause before an answer, a remembered gesture, or the warmth of an Irish street in June may not identify anyone, but it makes the record fuller. You listen for these details without asking them to become proof. Director Ciaran Cassidy approached the story through the known route of Peter Bergmann's final days. The film allowed surveillance pictures and present-day locations to sit beside one another, showing how little physical distance separated the hotel, post office, station, and coastline. You can trace the route with a fingertip across a street map. The mystery did not occupy a vast landscape, but several quiet miles held enough unseen space to preserve it. When the documentary screened internationally, including at the Sundance Film Festival in 2014, a local unidentified person case acquired a much broader audience. Viewers saw Bergmann move rather than merely reading a physical description, which gave them his posture, pace, and manner of carrying luggage. Movement can sometimes awaken recognition where a still photograph fails. Yet no verified identity emerged from that new attention. The footage showed a man whose movements appeared purposeful but not hurried. He crossed tiled floors, paused near counters, and carried his possessions with the familiar efficiency of someone accustomed to traveling alone. You might notice the slight forward angle of his shoulders, or the care with which he placed a bag. Such habits are intimate, though difficult to convert into searchable data. A family member might know that walk instantly, while an investigator can only describe it in general words. Gait analysis may distinguish broad patterns, but without a suspected person for comparison, it rarely supplies a legal name. The same limitation affects gestures, posture, and facial expressions. You can watch Bergmann 100 times and become familiar with him without becoming acquainted with his life. The purple bag moves within that footage as an extension of his routine. Sometimes it hangs low with apparent weight, while at other moments its thin sides seem easier to gather. The cameras cannot show whether he packed it in the privacy of his room or carried it already filled from somewhere else. You watch the hotel door open, then let the carrier pass into Sligo's uncovered streets. Later viewers sometimes treated the bag as if it had been recovered and lost by police, but the known account is more restrained. It was visible on surveillance recordings and during his movements, yet it never became a physical exhibit available for laboratory examination. The distinction protects the investigators from an unfair assumption that a labeled piece of evidence simply vanished. What disappeared was the traveler's possession before officers knew an inquiry would begin. This also explains why the bag has no known owner in the ordinary legal sense. The man carrying it used a false name. The carrier itself was never secured, and no receipt or identifying mark tied it to a purchaser. Ownership could be observed in practice, while remaining impossible to document. You see Bergmann holding it, though you cannot connect either the hand or the object to a verified identity. The bag may have belonged to him for years, or it may have been acquired shortly before the hotel stay. Reusable plastic carriers often migrate between homes, cars, shops, and journeys without anyone treating them as personal property. They are useful precisely because they demand little attention. In this case, that everyday anonymity echoed the anonymity of the person who carried one. But when broader attention still failed to provide a name, investigators returned to the quieter biological evidence preserved from the original examination. DNA can confirm that two samples come from the same person, or indicate that individuals share a biological relationship. In a conventional database search, an unknown sample is compared against profiles already stored under defined legal conditions. Peter Bergmann's profile produced no reported match capable of naming him. You imagine the computer finishing its comparison, leaving the case number unchanged beside a blank identity field. That result didn't mean he had no living relatives. It meant no suitable relative was present in the databases searched, or no available comparison was close enough under the methods and rules being used. Most people never enter official forensic collections, and relatives may live under several jurisdictions. The biological family tree can be extensive while remaining invisible to a police system. Investigative genetic genealogy later offered another approach in some countries. A fuller DNA profile can sometimes be compared with voluntarily shared genealogical data, finding distant cousins whose family trees lead gradually toward an unknown person. The process is methodical, requiring careful documentary research and confirmation rather than a single dramatic match. You can picture branches being drawn across a large sheet of paper, one birth record at a time. Such work has identified people in cases that remained unnamed for decades, but it also involves legal, ethical, technical, and jurisdictional limits. Consumer databases follow different policies, and law enforcement access varies by nation and by the circumstances of a case. Ireland's approach cannot simply be replaced by procedures used elsewhere. The Peter Bergmann file must move within the laws governing its own preserved evidence. Consent is part of that quiet difficulty. People who provide DNA for family history research may not expect their profiles to assist an unidentified person inquiry, even when the purpose is compassionate. Some databases permit carefully defined use, while others restrict it or require explicit participation. You sit with both aims at once, the wish to restore a name and the need to respect the privacy of living families. Sample quality also matters. A stored DNA sample suitable for standard identification may not automatically provide the dense genetic information needed for genealogical searching. Additional laboratory work could be required, and every use of finite material must be considered carefully. Preserving enough for future methods can be wiser than consuming it for a technique with uncertain prospects. Patience sometimes means choosing not to open a sealed tube yet. The identity search had already outlasted several generations of everyday technology. Mobile phones changed. Hotel booking systems became more demanding, and transport cameras improved in clarity. Had Bergmann made the same journey later, digital payments, device location, electronic reservations, or automated border records might have left a longer trail. In 2009, cash and paper still allowed a person to move with considerable privacy. His apparent lack of a mobile telephone was especially significant. Cameras didn't show him using one, and no handset was recovered among the known belongings. A phone might have supplied contacts, network records, language settings, photographs, or a subscriber account. Without it, investigators lost one of the richest personal archives carried by modern travelers. He may never have owned a mobile, which wouldn't have been extraordinary for every older person at that time. He may also have discarded one during the repeated walks from the hotel. If a handset entered a public bin before the investigation began, it could have traveled away with the same unobserved current as papers and medicine. You imagine its dark screen beneath the purple plastic, while keeping the image clearly within speculation. No computer, camera, or electronic storage device was connected to him either. His known trail was almost entirely analog, made from cash, clothing, stamps, buses, handwriting, and remembered speech. These things still preserve information, but they do not automatically report it to distant databases. The investigation therefore depended upon patient human comparison, rather than a convenient digital account. That analog quality gives the file its worn, lamplit atmosphere, though it was never romantic for those trying to identify him. Every missing receipt meant another route closed, and every false address required real hours of checking. Officers couldn't type the alias into one system and watch an entire life unfold. You feel the quiet labor behind each negative reply. Journalists who revisited the case spoke with Detective Inspector O'Reilly about that labor and the enduring frustration of the unseen disposals. He remembered the 13 departures and the absence of any clear recording showing Bergmann emptying the purple carrier. The repetition had stayed with him across the years. You can understand why one small bag became the detail a seasoned investigator found hardest to set aside. A detective learns that ordinary objects often carry the clearest personal links. Receipts name shops, keys suggest doors, medicine packets identify pharmacies, and photographs hold faces waiting to be recognized. If those were the things removed from Bergmann's room, then the purple bag briefly contained an entire network of possible leads. Its contents may have been modest in value, while being immeasurable to the case. The bag itself might also have carried a logo visible to someone who knew the original retailer. Investigators and viewers examined the footage, but no confirmed brand emerged. Plastic wrinkles distort printed designs, while compression breaks lettering into blocks of color. You lean closer to the screen until the pixels become larger, yet the hoped-for word never becomes reliably readable. Color perception complicates the task further. Hotel lighting may add warmth, camera sensors may shift blue toward violet, and copied footage can alter saturation. A carrier, remembered as purple, might have looked different beneath daylight or fluorescent tubes. Without the original object, no one can place it beneath neutral light and name the shade with certainty. Even if a retailer were identified, the lead might remain broad. Large chains distribute millions of bags across hundreds of stores, and shoppers reuse them for years. A design can indicate a country or period without identifying a purchaser. You note the manufacturer in one column, then discover that the possible customer list contains almost everyone who entered a shop during several seasons. The bag's physical wear might have narrowed its age, but only if recovered. Creases, faded ink, stretched handles, and tiny tears could suggest repeated use or a recent purchase. Fibers caught inside might show clothing colors, while dust or pollen could indicate environments beyond Sligo. All these possibilities remain locked inside an object the evidence room never received. This is where the case asks you to distinguish potential evidence from available evidence. The unknown contents might have solved everything, but imagined contents cannot be tested, logged, or presented as fact. Patient investigation works with what remains, not with what would have been convenient to find. You let the empty space stay empty, even when the mind wants to stock it with answers. As public interest grew, theories accumulated around the man's apparent wish for anonymity. Some imagined espionage because of the false name and methodical disposal, while others proposed criminal histories, secret relationships, or wartime experiences. No reliable evidence established those stories. The known medical condition and deliberate privacy offer enough to consider without turning a sick traveler into a character he may never have been. An older person facing terminal illness may have complicated reasons for leaving home quietly. Family estrangement, fear of dependency, financial worry, shame, or a wish to control how others remember him can all shape private decisions. None can be assigned to Bergmann, but each is more humanly ordinary than the elaborate plots sometimes built around his movements. You keep the tone low and the assumptions light. His choice of a beach can also be understood without treating it as a coded message. Ross's Point was recommended after he asked a local driver for a quiet place near the sea. The area offered open space, public transport, and a landscape in which someone could spend time alone without appearing unusual. You can hear the Atlantic moving gently beyond the strand as evening settles around his last known hours. If Sligo held earlier meaning for him, investigators never found the connection. No hotel register from a confirmed previous visit was matched to his real name, and no resident recalled him as a former neighbor or regular holidaymaker. Yet personal geography isn't always documented. A place glimpsed once in youth can remain important long after every receipt and companion has gone. He might have known the poetry, music, or landscape associated with County Sligo. Though no book or note confirms such an interest, he may simply have chosen the town because the bus route carried him there. A map can invite a destination through nothing more than its position beside water. You let the possible meanings drift apart, refusing to tie them into one neat knot. The return visits to the footage continued, partly because visual evidence feels so close to an answer. Bergmann is not a sketch assembled from uncertain witness memories. He is visibly present, moving through real rooms at recorded times. His image gives the sense that identification should be straightforward. Yet a face becomes searchable only when another record or person can attach a name to it. Facial recognition technology improved considerably after 2009, but applying it to an old international case brings its own limits. The available frames may lack sufficient resolution, and comparison collections differ in scope, legality, and accuracy. A system can generate possible similarities without proving identity. You would still need records, relatives, and DNA to turn resemblance into certainty. Age progression works in the opposite direction from many missing person cases. Investigators weren't trying to show what Bergmann might look like years later, because he was already deceased when the photographs circulated. They needed images from earlier decades to compare against him, perhaps when his hair was darker and his face fuller. Without a suspected name, those earlier photographs remained hidden in private albums and local archives. You can imagine such an album resting in a cupboard, its pages slightly tacky beneath transparent covers. A younger version of the man may stand beside a bicycle, a workplace doorway, or relatives at a summer table. The gold dental work might not yet be present, and the grey hair would offer no clue. Only someone who knew the continuity of that face could bridge the intervening years. Family photographs are powerful, precisely because they are not organized for police searches. They preserve birthdays, holidays, and ordinary afternoons, rather than fingerprints or formal measurements. If Bergmann's real image survives somewhere, it may be labeled with a nickname known only within one household. The answer could exist in clear view while remaining beyond every official database. You close the imaginary album carefully and return it to the shelf. Public appeals in later years tried to cross that gap. Gardai again asked for information about the unidentified man, repeating the date he entered the Sligo City Hotel and the date he was found at Ross's Point. His clothing was described in detail, including the German-made Finn comfort shoes and familiar retail brands. The hope was that several small recollections might gather around one person. A former shop assistant might remember fitting unusual shoes, although the purchase had occurred years before the Sligo journey. A neighbor could recall the black leather jacket, while a dentist might recognize the arrangement of restorations. Each detail alone was weak, but together they could support a careful identification. You can see why investigators preserve even the most ordinary description of a belt or jumper. The shoes carried a production date from 2002, offering a minimum history of several years before they reached Ross's Point. They may have been worn regularly, resoled, or kept for occasional travel. Their comfort-oriented design could suit someone managing pain or fatigue, though that inference remains uncertain. You place them beside the medical report and notice a possible relationship without declaring it proven. The size, 44, helped confirm the general physical profile. Shoe size alone covers countless people, but combined with height, build, age, and accent, it shapes a more coherent description. Investigators often work through such overlapping circles until one candidate remains. In this case, every circle stayed too wide, and no central name appeared beneath the compass. The gold tooth was more visually distinctive. A person who spoke with him regularly might remember the brief flash of metal when he smiled or pronounced certain words. Hotel staff retained the detail because it stood out during close conversation. You can almost hear a remembered voice forming careful English beneath the low murmur of the reception area. Yet media images chosen for appeals may not display dental work clearly, especially when drawn from surveillance footage. A written description reaches only those who read closely, and recognition can fail when one familiar feature is absent. The public may see an unknown older man rather than the neighbor whose smile looked different in person. Such small mismatches can keep memory from fully opening. His height and thin build may also have been influenced by illness. Someone searching older photographs might remember a heavier or more robust man who no longer resembled the traveler in Sligo. Advanced disease changes posture, face, and movement over time. You allow for that transformation as you compare the surviving stills with faces imagined from a healthier past. The missing kidney offered a stronger biographical marker, but it too required the right records. A relative might know of major surgery without knowing the medical term, hospital, or exact year. If family relationships had broken down, they might not know about the operation at all. The man's body carried a chapter. His closest acquaintances may never have read. Cancer treatment could have occurred under a health service number, insurance account, or specialist clinic file. If he gave his real identity during treatment, that record would contain one of the strongest potential matches. But searching every relevant institution across German-speaking Europe would be impractical without a narrower lead. You see shelves of paper charts extending down corridors, each one properly filed and effectively unreachable. Privacy laws protect those records for good reasons, even when investigators seek a compassionate identification. Authorities generally need legal grounds and sufficiently specific information before opening an individual's confidential history. A broad request for every older male patient with one kidney would gather too many people and expose too much personal data. The path toward a name must remain both useful and lawful. This tension rarely appears in simplified retellings. It is easy to imagine that police can search every hospital, border crossing, bank, and government registry with one command. In practice, systems are fragmented and governed by separate rules, especially across countries. You sit with the case long enough to appreciate how much patient coordination lies behind a single international check. Some records from 2009 may also have depended on spellings that vary across languages. Bergmann can appear with one or two final letters in public accounts, while street names and abbreviations may be transcribed differently. A minor error can prevent a database match if the surrounding information is already false. Investigators must search variations without letting the alias consume the entire inquiry. The hotel registration reportedly gave a Vienna address that sounded plausible at a quick glance, but failed detailed verification. Whether Bergmann invented it completely or adapted a real address remains uncertain. He may have written from memory, altered digits, or combined a street-like word with an incompatible postal code. You examine the sequence as a possible construction, rather than a doorway that simply couldn't be found. If fragments were real, linguistic specialists might ask whether the spelling reflected German habits, foreign hearing, or purposeful distortion. Handwriting complicates the reading because a letter can resemble another, especially on a hurried hotel card. Several interpretations circulated, but none produced a verified residence. The address remains less a destination than a small puzzle of ink and sound. Postal codes can narrow a location effectively when accurate, yet a false combination may point nowhere or toward an unrelated municipality. Bergmann may have known enough about Austrian formatting to satisfy a receptionist without expecting formal verification. Hotels at the time often accepted cash guests with less documentation than would later become common. The registration desk gave him shelter, and the false address gave investigators only distance. His choice of Vienna may still indicate familiarity. People invent details from material already available in memory, selecting cities, numbers, and surnames encountered elsewhere. A completely random falsehood is difficult to produce because imagination borrows from experience. You can treat the address as a faint psychological trace, though no method can tell you which part came from life. The name Peter Bergmann may work similarly. It could belong to an acquaintance, a public figure, a character, or no remembered person at all. Both words are common enough that coincidence remains entirely plausible. Investigators checked the alias as required, but the search generated too many real people and no connection to the Sligo traveller. A borrowed name can conceal precisely because it belongs to many others. If the alias came from his own family history, Genealogical research might someday uncover the reason. A mother's surname, an ancestor's occupation, or a childhood neighbor could have shaped the choice. But without his real family tree, that line of inquiry loops back upon itself. You place the name at the center of the page and find no branch willing to grow outward. Renewed public interest brought amateur researchers to the file, some of whom searched missing person databases across Europe. Their energy widened attention, though online comparisons required great caution. Two older men may share facial proportions while having entirely different histories, and an appealing resemblance can distract from contradictory dates. Patient work asks for documentation before emotional certainty. You compare gently, then let unsupported candidates go. Families of missing people can be harmed by confident online claims. A photograph may be circulated beside Bergmann's image, inviting strangers to declare a match before authorities have examined DNA or medical details. The relatives then face renewed uncertainty and public speculation. Compassion requires that possible names be passed privately to investigators rather than announced as solved. You keep every living person inside that circle of care. The same care applies to theories about why he removed identifying marks. A deliberate wish for anonymity doesn't grant permission to assign shameful motives. People protect privacy for reasons that may be tender, practical, or impossible for outsiders to understand. Bergmann's actions affected the investigation, but they do not define his moral character. We can study the method without judging the person who used it. The purple bag becomes gentler when viewed in that way. It may have been a tool for arranging his affairs rather than a symbol of deception. Each walk could represent an attempt to reduce the burden carried forward, physically and emotionally. You cannot know whether those journeys brought him peace, but you can follow them without turning them into a chase. The camera observes. It doesn't accuse. Hotel corridors are particularly suited to this quiet kind of anonymity. Guests leave rooms carrying parcels, shopping, laundry, and bags without explanation, while staff respect their ordinary privacy. No one had reason to ask what Bergmann carried or why he returned without it. By the time the question mattered, the corridor could offer only its silent recording. You hear the lift doors close, then the soft retreat of footsteps. A modern viewer may wonder why staff didn't ask for identification at check-in. Policies vary by country, hotel, and period, and a cash-paying guest in 2009 might complete a form without presenting a passport. Nothing about his manner prompted suspicion. The system worked as it was designed for an ordinary traveler, granting temporary privacy in exchange for payment and a written name. Another viewer may wonder why every bin wasn't searched immediately. The answer is time. Bergmann's repeated departures became significant only after he was found and the footage was collected, by which point municipal rubbish had moved through routine handling. Investigators cannot preserve evidence before an event tells them what deserves preservation. You feel the calendar turning quietly against them. This gap between action and recognition is common in cold cases. A witness throws away a receipt, a camera overwrites footage, or rain washes a surface before anyone knows it matters. The loss isn't always negligence. Often it is ordinary life proceeding without warning. Peter Bergmann's purple bag passed through exactly that narrow interval between being mundane and becoming important. Once important, it could no longer be recovered by attention alone. Journalists could describe it. Artists could recreate its color, and investigators could replay every appearance, but none of those acts restored the physical carrier. The object became clearer in cultural memory, while remaining absent from the evidence store. You can almost feel its imagined handles, which is different from being able to test them. This difference also shapes the title's question. The bag has no known owner because its carrier has no verified name, but the phrase carries another, quieter meaning. No relative has said, yes, that was the bag kept beside his kitchen door, or the one he took on shopping trips. No familiar voice has connected the object with domestic memory. Ownership is more than possession at a recorded moment. It includes the history of choosing, buying, storing, folding, and reusing a thing until it becomes part of someone's habits. The cameras confirm that Bergmann controlled the bag in Sligo, yet they cannot reveal whether he considered it his. You sit with this small legal and human distinction as rain touches the archive window. If it came from a hotel, shop, or station, shortly before the footage began, another person may have handed it to him during a routine purchase. That clerk would have seen only one customer among many, and no reason to preserve the encounter. A printed logo might once have linked the exchange to a counter, but the image no longer displays it clearly. The possible chain of custody begins in mist. If he brought it from home, the bag traveled farther than any confirmed document in the case. It may have crossed borders folded inside his suitcase, carrying the faint dust and fibers of rooms investigators never located. In that sense, the missing carrier could have been the most geographically informative object he possessed. You imagine it resting beneath clothing before being opened in the Sligo City Hotel's quiet room. What he placed inside during those 3 days remains equally unknowable. The bag might have held labels removed earlier, medicine packaging, notes, address books, photographs, receipts, or items with names sewn or printed upon them. It could also have contained ordinary refuse from the room. You resist the urge to decide because every invented inventory risks becoming false memory. False memory can enter public case accounts through repetition. One writer proposes an object, another repeats it without qualification, and eventually readers believe investigators recovered or witnessed it. Careful retelling keeps returning to the narrow wording of the known evidence. Bergmann left repeatedly with a visibly filled purple carrier and returned without visible contents. The contents themselves were never established. That sentence is quieter than speculation, but it is sounder. The number 13 also attracts more meaning than it should. It records repeated, observed departures, not a symbolic choice known to Bergmann. Depending upon camera angles and definitions, it may reflect how investigators counted separate sequences. You write the number in words, then let it remain an administrative total rather than an omen. Nothing in this case benefits from artificial foreboding. During those departures, some journeys may have been short smoking breaks combined with disposal, while others may have taken him farther through town. The available accounts do not provide a complete minute-by-minute route for every trip. What matters is the repeated contrast between a full carrier going out and no visible load returning. You follow the pattern without pretending. Every footstep has been mapped. Mapping could still help future review. If timestamps survive accurately, routes can be estimated according to the time between departure and return. Public bins present in 2009 might be reconstructed from council plans, business photographs, or street imagery. Yet knowing where he could have gone doesn't restore material removed long ago. The map offers understanding rather than recovery. There is value in understanding, even when recovery is impossible. It can show that Bergmann didn't require secret knowledge to avoid the cameras, only ordinary awareness and several uncovered places. It can distinguish a plausible disposal route from a story of extraordinary skill. You walk the reconstructed streets at an even pace, noticing doorways, side lanes, and the soft noise of the river. The town itself explains much of the apparent vanishing. This gentler interpretation preserves the human scale of the case. A seriously ill man may have taken repeated walks with a shopping bag, discarding traces because he wanted privacy. Local cameras caught the beginning and end of those walks, but not their central action. Nothing more elaborate is required by the evidence. The unresolved part is the name, not necessarily the method, but identifying him still requires someone or something to cross the distance between Sligo and his earlier life. DNA might reach a relative, a medical archive might yield a match, or a public appeal might finally encounter the right memory. Each route depends upon conditions beyond the original detective's control. You sense their patience in preserving the material for people and tools that may arrive later. A renewed Garda appeal in 2021 again presented the known facts to the public. It noted that international checks and DNA comparisons had not identified him, while repeating descriptions of the clothing found at Ross's Point. Years had passed, but the request remained simple. Someone, somewhere, might know the face or recognize the particular combination of medical and personal details. The appeal appeared alongside efforts to identify other unknown people recovered in Western Ireland, reminding listeners that Bergmann's case wasn't the only file without a name. Each unidentified person carried a separate history, and officials were careful not to suggest the cases were connected. You can imagine several folders laid apart on a table, each awaiting its own answer. Shared silence doesn't create a shared story. For Peter Bergmann, the renewed attention brought the hotel footage back into newspapers and online reports. New viewers studied the black jacket, the careful walk, and the luggage at Sligo station. The purple bag appeared again in descriptions, sometimes more vividly than in the underlying images. You return to the original still and let its muted color settle beneath the screen's pale glow. By then, more than a decade had passed since the June weekend. A relative who was young in 2009 might now be old enough to search family history independently. Someone clearing a parent's home could find correspondence, an Irish map, or a photograph that suddenly gives the public image context. Cold cases sometimes move when one generation opens the cupboards, another generation kept closed. Changes in language access also widened the audience. Online translation made it easier for German or Austrian readers to understand Irish reporting, while social networks carried appeals between local groups. A face once confined mainly to regional broadcasts could circulate across many communities. Still, circulation remained different from targeted recognition, and the file required more than views. In 2023, Locate International issued another appeal focused upon the unidentified Sligo man. The organization works with missing person and unidentified person cases, bringing trained volunteers and researchers to records that may benefit from fresh comparison. Their involvement introduced more patient eyes without changing the evidentiary standard. You can hear another box being placed gently upon a well-lit table. Researchers could compare Bergmann's profile with missing men reported across Europe, examine travel possibilities, and look for patterns in historical records. They could also present the case in languages and forums more likely to reach relevant communities. Every plausible candidate would still require official confirmation. The purpose of widening the search was not to announce a theory, but to find a verifiable path. One area of inquiry involved his possible connection to German-speaking institutions, including workplaces, medical systems, or structured organizations whose former members might remember him. An appeal can ask retired staff to look closely at posture, facial shape, or a gold tooth. Memory after many years is uncertain, but collective memory sometimes preserves what formal databases miss. You sit among those imagined witnesses, each turning slowly through an internal album. A former colleague might remember that someone stopped coming to work, though retirement or illness had seemed explanation enough. A neighbor could recall an apartment emptied by a landlord without knowing where the tenant went. A distant cousin may have received no news and assumed estrangement. These small, unconnected understandings could all belong to one life without ever meeting in the same room. That is often how a person remains unidentified despite living for 60 or more years. The information isn't necessarily absent. It is divided among people who do not know that their fragments belong together. Police hold the final photographs, a clinic holds the surgical record, and a relative holds the childhood name. Patient investigation tries to bring those separate rooms into quiet communication. You can feel the doors standing just slightly apart. The purple bag may once have contained the bridge between them. A prescription could join the clinic to the body. An address book could join relatives to the alias. And a key could join a home to the journey. Its missing contents, therefore, represent not only objects, but relationships. You look once more at the bag's shape on the screen, and consider the invisible network folded inside it. Yet there is another kind of patience required here, because the man may have intended those relationships to remain separate. Identification serves dignity and legal clarity, but it can also reopen pain for people who believed a different story. Investigators must approach any possible family with care, allowing confirmation to proceed privately. The answer, if it comes, belongs first to those most directly connected to him. That consideration does not stop the search, though it shapes its tone. Public appeals can be precise without being intrusive, and forensic methods can follow lawful safeguards. The case can be discussed without publishing unsupported names or exposing private histories. You keep your voice low beside the file, remembering that somewhere beyond it may be people who never asked to become part of a mystery. As the renewed researchers worked, they inherited both the strengths and gaps of the original investigation. The timeline in Sligo was unusually rich, the medical profile detailed, and biological samples preserved. Against those strengths stood the missing luggage, unrecovered purple carrier, false address, and uncertain route before Derry. The case had many pieces, but the central connecting piece remained elsewhere. Travel records might still contain overlooked information from the days before the 12th of June. Ferry manifests, airline bookings, or hotel registrations could include a man matching his description under another name. Yet searching them without a real name is difficult, and retention periods may have erased many routine records. You can hear old computer drives spinning down and paper schedules being recycled as years quietly pass. Border movement between the United Kingdom and Ireland also allowed many journeys without the kind of detailed identity trail found at more tightly controlled crossings. If Bergmann came through Britain or Northern Ireland, he may have travelled using cash and ordinary public transport. The Derry camera gives a starting point only because it survived and was found. His route before that frame remains an unlit stretch of film. A suitcase change could suggest that some possessions were placed into left luggage or transferred elsewhere before Ross's Point. Investigators examined the known stations and available footage, but no recovered case was conclusively linked to him. Storage facilities require records only according to their systems and time. An uncollected bag might eventually be opened, yet no such discovery supplied his name. The possibility of an unrecognized item in lost property storage naturally attracts attention. Labels may be missing, contents ordinary, and the connection to one hotel guest impossible to see without a date and photograph. Over years, unclaimed property is disposed of according to policy. You imagine shelves of black suitcases beneath handwritten tags, every one resembling the shape on a grainy screen. If Bergmann deliberately replaced his first case, the original may have held more identifying features than the newer one. Wear marks, old travel stickers, or repair labels could link it with years of movement. Removing that case before checkout would fit the broader pattern of reducing traceable belongings. Still, the footage's quality leaves open whether two genuinely different pieces of luggage were seen. This detail deserves the same restraint as the bag. We note that reports described a change in luggage, then avoid building an unseen transaction around it. A second-hand purchase, an exchange, or a simple visual misinterpretation all remain possible. You let the silhouettes stay uncertain at their edges, as they are in the original images. The stamps remain another small object around which future research might turn. Postal rates from that weekend could indicate the likely weight or destination class he intended, though 8 stamps don't necessarily correspond to 8 separate letters. Airmail labels suggest international mailing, but those too may have been purchased from habit. You place the denominations beside the postal tables and find several plausible routes. If envelopes were mailed from Sligo, cancellation marks could identify the office, but not the sender. Tracing them would require knowing the recipients or locating mail preserved by chance. Most ordinary letters from 2009 have long since been discarded. Somewhere, however, a folded page could remain in a drawer, carrying handwriting that matches the hotel form. A handwriting comparison would then become meaningful. Investigators could examine letter formation, pressure, spacing, and repeated habits, while DNA from an envelope might offer another careful route if lawfully preserved. Such a discovery would be rare, but cold cases sometimes turn upon ordinary paper kept for personal reasons. You can smell the faint dryness of an old envelope as it opens beneath patient hands. For now, no confirmed letter has entered the evidence. The stamps, therefore, remain a purchase without a documented use, much like the purple bag remains a carrier without known contents. Both objects point outward from the timeline and then disappear. Their parallel silence gives the weekend its peculiar rhythm, one of preparation followed by missing destinations. As researchers revisited the case, they could also examine the cultural familiarity of his clothing. Retail histories might show where certain C and A garments were sold, while serial details in the shoes narrowed their manufacturing period. Fashion catalogs, archived advertisements, and former employees could add context. Yet mass-produced clothing is designed to belong to many people, and its clues often remain statistical. Wear patterns can reveal how a garment was used, though public reports offer limited detail about such examinations. A jacket faded at one shoulder might suggest driving habits, and trouser hems can reflect alterations by a particular tailor. These observations become useful only when paired with comparison material. Without his home wardrobe, they describe habit without naming the person who formed it. The removed labels might themselves have shown a consistent cutting technique. Scissors leave different edges from a knife, and labels removed long before travel may show softened seams, unlike freshly cut threads. If all were removed at the same time, that could support deliberate preparation. You examine the imagined fibers under magnification, while acknowledging that the publicly available record doesn't settle when the cutting occurred. Some people routinely remove every label from clothing because of skin sensitivity. Illness, weight loss, or treatment can also make seams uncomfortable. Bergmann's advanced condition may have changed how fabric felt against him. This ordinary explanation can coexist with broader evidence of concealment, and you needn't force one motive to account for every detail. A careful investigator allows actions to have multiple causes. A label might itch and also reveal a shop. A bag might carry rubbish and also private records. Human choices are rarely arranged for the convenience of later interpretation. You sit with that complexity until it feels less like confusion and more like an honest account of a life observed only at its edge. The medical condition remains, perhaps, the clearest context for his journey. Advanced cancer and serious cardiac disease gave him reason to understand that time was limited, even without a final written statement. His lack of treatment during the Sligo stay suggests he wasn't traveling in order to seek care there. You can feel the weight of that knowledge without entering the private room of his decision. He may have wanted to spare others the practical aftermath, though anonymity created a different burden for local officials and investigators. He may not have anticipated how carefully strangers would work to identify him. People often imagine disappearance as the removal of concern, without seeing how unanswered absence travels outward. The file itself became evidence of that continuing care. Detectives, who never knew his real name, nevertheless learned the details of his last breakfast, shoes, and movements. Pathologists documented old illness, drivers remembered his questions, and hotel staff preserved his manner. Volunteers years later examined his face with patience. Anonymity did not prevent him from being attended to. It changed the form that attention took. The purple bag stands at the center of that attention because it may show him actively shaping what others could learn. With each trip, the file suggests a person editing his own material record. Yet editing always leaves traces of selection. Even when the selected contents disappear, you observe the full bag, the empty hand, and the interval between them, reading absence as carefully as presence. For investigators, the next task was to decide which modern methods could safely and realistically address that absence. DNA genealogy, enhanced international appeals, archival medical research, and renewed image circulation each offered possibilities with different limits. None promised a quick answer. The file returned to the desk not with urgency, but with several new avenues marked in calm pencil. One avenue led again toward continental Europe, where an older missing person report might never have been digitized. Local police archives can contain paper notices that were not entered into later international systems. Volunteers may search regional newspapers, cemetery records, and community bulletins for a man who vanished around June 2009. You can almost hear microfilm turning beneath the library reader's soft mechanical whir. The relevant notice might not describe him as missing at all. It could mention a retired man selling possessions, ending a tenancy, or failing to attend a club meeting. A small obituary for a relative might name him among survivors, fixing his location shortly before the journey. Genealogical work advances through these sideways references, gathering a life from the margins of other records. Another avenue led through former medical professionals. A public appeal, including the absent kidney, gold dental work, advanced prostate cancer, and heart disease, might reach someone who remembered an unusual combination. Retired clinicians often retain strong memories of patients, even when formal files are difficult to locate. Recognition would still require lawful confirmation, but it could supply the missing starting name. The challenge is presenting enough detail to awaken memory without releasing private information irresponsibly. Investigators choose which medical facts serve identification and which remain protected. Media summaries may therefore differ slightly according to what officials were prepared to disclose at the time. You read them side by side, noting variations without assuming that every omission signals a hidden secret. A third avenue led through the man's accent and speech. If any audio recording existed, linguists might analyze vowels, consonants, rhythm, and learned English patterns for regional clues. Publicly known footage was largely visual, and witness memories couldn't reproduce an exact voice years later. The accent therefore remained a description rather than a recording. You listen to the silence where his spoken words should be. Hotel clerks and drivers remembered him communicating effectively, despite the strong accent. That suggests some experience using English, perhaps through work, travel, education, or earlier visits. It doesn't establish fluency or residence in an English-speaking country. A handful of practical questions can be learned and delivered confidently. The file records successful exchanges, not an extended measure of his language. His request for a nice, quiet beach was clear enough for the taxi driver to recommend Ross's Point. The phrasing may have been translated directly from his first language, or it may have been entirely natural English. Without a recording, linguistic nuance cannot be tested. You keep the remembered sentence as a human moment rather than a coded clue. Another route involved the black luggage seen at checkout and the bus station. Manufacturers, sizes, and designs could perhaps be compared with products sold in Europe during the preceding years. But dark rolling cases are among the most common travel objects, and low-resolution images flatten distinctive features. You study wheels, pockets, and zipper lines until they merge into the ordinary outline of travel. The shoulder bag may have been more personal, perhaps used for documents, cigarettes, or money kept close to the body. It remained with him through much of the known journey, yet it too wasn't recovered beside the shoreline. If any bag carried his final identifying material, the shoulder bag is as important as the purple carrier. Public memory simply holds the color more easily than the dark shape. Color makes one object narratively visible, while another recedes. Detectives must guard against this imbalance, giving equal attention to every item, regardless of how memorable it appears in a headline. The black bags may have held more stable ownership clues, while the purple carrier merely moved rubbish. You rearrange the evidence in your mind, refusing to let vividness determine importance. Still, the repeated use gives the carrier a procedural significance no other object shares. It accompanies the suspected removal of possessions across several journeys, linking the hotel room with unseen disposal sites. That pattern is why the bag persists in the case's title and in the memory of investigators. You follow it because of repetition, not because purple itself contains an answer. As evening settles over our desk, the later appeal papers remain open beside the older photographs. The print is sharper than the original video, though Bergmann's expression still resists easy interpretation. He appears neither theatrical nor disguised, only tired, composed, and intent upon the small task before him. You let the page rest beneath your hand as researchers begin comparing that face with records from another country. That comparison has never produced a confirmed name, and the careful work around Peter Bergmann remains unfinished. No relative has been publicly identified, no former home has been located, and no document has connected the man at Ross's Point with a verified life elsewhere. The case remains unsolved and open to information, while his preserved DNA and fingerprints continue to wait for a lawful match. The purple bag has never been recovered, and its contents have never been established. No retailer, receipt, witness, or surviving mark has given it a documented owner beyond the unidentified man seen carrying it through the Sligo City Hotel. Perhaps it held the simple papers of an ordinary life, though even that cannot be known. You let the uncertainty remain gentle, without asking the absent object to explain more than it can. Somewhere, there may still be a photograph in which he stands beneath another name, surrounded by people who once understood the sound of his voice. There may be a medical record, a dental chart, or a letter whose handwriting matches the quiet line on the hotel form. Until such a connection is made and properly confirmed, Peter Bergmann remains the name of his final journey, not the name with which his life began. For tonight, you can leave the evidence where it has been kept with such patience, the photographs resting inside their sleeves, and the old paper settling beneath the small circle of lamplight. Beyond the window, Sligo grows quiet, and the Atlantic continues its slow breathing against Ross's Point. The file stays open without demanding anything further from you, while the purple bag passes once more beyond the camera's pale glow, carrying its unanswered history softly into the night.